War was once the domain of nations, a decision weighed in parliaments, decreed by kings, debated by presidents. But in the 21st century, war has been outsourced. Outsourced to men who carry no flags, who swear no oath to the people whose taxes pay them, who answer only to a contract. These are the private militaries, the shadow armies. They profit as long as the fighting continues. They thrive not on peace, but on the promise that conflict will never end. From the colonial companies that conquered continents, to the corporate contractors of the War on Terror, to the mercenary groups who trade blood for gold in today's proxy wars, one lesson endures. Where war can be bought, it will be sold. This is the story of how war became a business. This is Money Toxic. Long before the term private military company existed, war was already for sale. The British East India Company raised an army larger than that of many nations, fighting not for a crown, but for trade routes and profit. That idea, that war could be privatized, never disappeared. In the 1960s and 70s, as empires fell and new nations rose, mercenaries became the hired guns of civil wars across Africa. They were not patriots. They were professionals, selling violence to whoever paid. In Congo, Angola, and Sierra Leone, outfits like Executive Outcomes fought not for ideology, but for access to diamonds, oil, and gold. Their contracts often paid them not just in cash, but in resource concessions, turning bloodshed into business. Villages saw the trucks arrive at dawn, men with rifles and dead eyes stepping off, ready to secure the mines at any cost. When the Cold War ended, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were demobilized. They had skills, and no peacetime use for them. The demand for soldiers never disappeared. It simply went private. The mercenaries traded ragged uniforms for corporate logos. They registered companies. They pitched their services as security solutions. The shadow industry was born, not to win wars, but to keep them going. The 9/11 attacks opened the floodgates. The United States launched the War on Terror, and with it came a blank check for war spending. The military needed boots on the ground, and the private sector stepped in to fill the gap. Blackwater, DynCorp, KBR, Triple Canopy, corporate names that became as common as regimental ones. By 2008, there were more contractors than U.S. troops in Iraq. Some contractors earned 5 to 10 times the pay of soldiers, working side by side yet bound to different rules. The longer the war dragged on, the more money there was to be made. Peace was not in their business plan. Civilians in Baghdad and Kabul often couldn't tell the difference between soldiers and contractors, except that the contractors were less accountable, quicker to shoot, and almost impossible to prosecute. The marketplace of war had eclipsed the battlefield. In a national war, the goal is to win and end it. In a privatized war, the goal is to keep the contracts alive. The U.S. spent over $14 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. At least $4 trillion went to private contractors. In Afghanistan, some years saw more contractors than soldiers on the ground, and no company symbolized the system better than Halliburton and its subsidiary KBR. Under cost-plus contracts, the more KBR spent, the more profit it made. Investigations revealed charges of $45 for a six-pack of soda, over $100 for a bag of laundry, meals billed but never served. Entire convoys were sometimes dispatched into dangerous routes, not out of necessity, but because every trip meant another invoice. Halliburton made over $39 billion from Iraq alone. A bombed-out road wasn't just a tragedy, it was a future project. A destroyed school wasn't just collateral damage, it was a new contract. Destruction created demand. Demand created profit. Profit fueled more contracts. Soldiers sought victory. Contractors thrived on chaos. In this new economy of conflict, war was no longer a means to an end. It was the product itself. When war is privatized, accountability dies first. September 16, 2007, Nisar Square, Baghdad. Blackwater contractors opened fire on a crowded traffic circle. 17 Iraqi civilians were killed, men, women, and children. More than 20 others were wounded. Witnesses said there was no attack on the convoy, only gunfire unleashed on unarmed people. For years, the contractors evaded prosecution under immunity clauses. A decade later, a few were convicted, only to be pardoned in 2020. To Iraqis, it was proof that their lives were expendable in the eyes of those who profited from war. And Nisour Square was only one chapter. 2018, Central African Republic. The Wagner Group, operating under the guise of security assistance, moved into regions rich in gold and diamonds. Witnesses reported entire villages emptied, men beaten or killed, women assaulted, families driven into the jungle. Mass graves were found near mining sites controlled by Wagner-linked firms. The violence was not random. It followed the map of resources. From Baghdad to Bangui, the story was the same. Civilians caught between armed men whose loyalty was not to peace, but to profit. Wagner turned privatized war into a global franchise. They arrived in conflict-torn nations with the promise of stability, and left with the contracts to exploit gold, diamonds, and oil. They proved that in the modern era, the fight is not for ideology, but for who controls the revenue streams of conflict. This is the logical end of privatized war. Companies that both fuel the instability and profit from protecting against it. From the oil fields of Syria to the diamond pits of the Central African Republic, the new mercenaries do not just fight wars, they invest in them. Wars once ended with treaties and the return of soldiers. Privatized wars often leave behind dependency, instability, and a generation that has known nothing but conflict. In Iraq, parents still tell their children about the day men in armored SUVs opened fire at Nisour Square and how the killers walked free. In Afghanistan, 2 decades of war built an entire economy around outside contractors. When the foreign troops and the money left, the state they had propped up collapsed almost overnight. In the Central African Republic, villagers whisper the name Wagner like a curse, living in the shadow of mines that drew the mercenaries in and continue to fund further conflict. Nations that outsource their battles often discover they have also outsourced their sovereignty. Decisions about when and how to fight belong in part to companies that profit from conflict. For many veterans, the legacy is personal, coming home disillusioned, only to return to the same battlefields as contractors, earning more but fighting for less. For civilians, the legacy is harsher. A world where conflict feels endless, where a fragile peace can shatter because instability itself has become profitable. This is the true cost of privatized war. It does not merely destroy buildings and lives today. It leaves behind a cycle of fear and fragility that shapes tomorrow. As long as war remains profitable, there will always be those willing to sustain it. The graves in Baghdad, the mass graves in the Central African Republic, the hollowed-out streets of Kabul. These are not the footprints of necessary wars fought to end violence. They are the byproducts of a marketplace that feeds on human suffering. Unless the cycle is broken, future generations will inherit not the promise of peace, but the machinery of a permanent war economy. And as the wars become less about borders and more about balance sheets, the question that should haunt the world is simple. If war is a business, who will ever profit from peace? War was once an act of last resort. Now it is a service for hire. It no longer needs a cause. It only needs a client. From the mercenaries of the past to the contractors of Iraq to the Wagner fighters trading blood for gold, one lesson endures. As long as conflict is profitable, peace will be at risk. The graves in Baghdad, the burned-out villages in Mali, the endless invoices for rebuilding what was destroyed. These are not mistakes. They are the price of a system that treats war as a commodity. And as long as the marketplace demands it, the next war is never far away. This is money toxic. This is the story of what happens when the battlefield becomes just another business, and peace becomes the only thing no one is selling. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to help support our channel.